So I'll start out with introducing our first speaker, Barbara Bentz, who's a research entomologist at with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, U.S. Forest Service. She's based in Logan, Utah. She's also an adjunct professor at Utah State University. And Barbara is one of the real experts on bark beetles, and I can say she wrote the book, edited the book, which I think is the single best, for the general reader volume to explain bark beetle infestations. It's called Bark Beetle Outbreaks in Western North America, Causes and Consequences. I don't think it's available online. It's only in print from...
No, but we're going to revise it so it can't be more.
Okay, but if you're interested, University of Utah Press, if you just Google bark beetle and causes and consequences at $8. $4 or $5 now? Okay, great. All right, so without further ado, Barbara, to kind of set the scene for us. The beetles, what do they do? Where are they? Where are they going?
Thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm a entomologist. So I was asked to provide sort of the insect viewpoints on what's going on, sort of what drives them, and talk a little bit about some patterns. So this is for the whole western U.S., and I'm just showing, as Scott mentioned, there's all kinds of different insects that are working in forests, and I'm just showing the three sort of major ones here. Spruce beetle, mountain pine beetle, and pinyon, just as accumulated over the past about more than 10 years. Let's see. So again, there's many species of native bark beetles that are specific to particular host tree types. Is there a pointer? Oh, there, okay. So in spruce, it's spruce beetle, Syndactylus dustbur, Scott mentioned, has been active as well. And then in pines, there's, in this region would be mountain pine beetle, round-headed pine beetle, which is pretty similar in size. Mountain pine beetle, but it doesn't get anywhere really north of that southern Utah. Arizona 5-spined, it gets into ponderosa pine. Western pine beetle, you'll also find here in Colorado, in southern Colorado, in ponderosa pine. Pinyon was responsible for quite a bit of tree mortality in the early 2000s. It only gets in pinyons, and then a couple of species that get into tree fir. So I'm going to focus mostly on spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle because those are the ones that are influencing what's going on in this area. So I always like to say, there's so much going on now with bark beetles, but we have to remember that it's been going on for a long time. There's from written records back in the past century, as well as dendroecological information showing time periods in the past when there have been pulses of activity by bark beetles. And there's some sediment coring that's been done showing activity as well back during the Holocene. So while we're seeing things now, it's not necessarily anything new. So this is just showing a time span of the spatial one that I showed you recently, just before. This pulse here is almost entirely due to the pinyonids in pinyon in the southwest. You can see that there's been a sort of a peak here in the late 2000s and then sort of been dropping, although that varies by insect species as well as by state. So this is, again, all of those native species that I mentioned, of fir, spruce, it's all of them. And you can see that the timing of when activity has occurred varies among the states as well as the amount. On the y-axis is the million acres affected, and it's standardized. So the y-axis is the same for all the states. You can see the states that have had the most tree mortality caused by this insect. And again, in the southwest, this peak, again by pinyon. And I'm happy to answer questions as I go along if you have if that's okay. I mean, that's fine with me if you have a question. So what is it that drives these bark beetles? They're at endemic levels all over the place. And I wish I had the answer, which I don't have the answer, but I'll give you some of our thoughts on what we think contributes. So the first thing is you have to have food. So these insects require, they feed on the phloem of trees, and so you have to have trees out there. And the bigger the tree, the more phloem, so the more food. And this is this legacy of past management, this thinking that perhaps in some lodgepole pine stands, fire suppression created these dense stands with sort of fairly large trees that could be responsible, or at least contributing to what's going on in northern Colorado anyway. So since we're focused on spruce beetle, I thought I'd bring up a recent study that Matt Hansen, who works with me, did, where he was interested in looking at how thinning might influence the susceptibility of a spruce stand to spruce beetle. And it's interesting what he found was, so he was looking at, it's very difficult to go out to a thinning and then have the insect come right when you want it to come and give pressure, for the thinning. So he did a retrospective study and found stands that had been treated and then were subsequently attacked by spruce beetle. And so what he found was that the stands that had been treated indeed had less tree mortality due to spruce beetles, but that the untreated stands actually had more residual spruce left because they started with more, which was an interesting finding. And he didn't see any differences in regeneration between treated and untreated as well. And so with some of the work that he found from this, as well as suggested some refinements to the Schmidt and Fry system, which has been used to rate spruce stands. Most importantly, to think about how the spruce stand density and the spruce BA, rather than the total stand BA, would be more important than just the total BA. BA. Basal area, sorry. Basal area of the stand. Sorry about that. So assuming you have a susceptible landscape, there's a number of different factors that can potentially trigger an outbreak to occur. So temperature, I'll speak in just a minute about how temperature influences these insects. Pathogens that weaken the host, and these are all sort of factors that weaken the defenses of the host trees. For spruce beetle, wind throw, avalanches, logging residue, spruce beetle is known more than some of the other dendrochthonous species to get into trees that are on the ground, potentially because spruce falls over more than some of the other species, so they've evolved that response. And then drought. So there's been quite a bit of work done on drought recently and how it influences bark beetles. Most of the work has been done in the Southwest, looking at the pinyon system, the pinyon and pinyon ips system. And so when drought occurs, it can influence not only the size but the number of resin ducts, and it will also influence the carbohydrates that are available not only for the compounds that are available in the defense, but also the hydraulic, just the sheer turner capacity that's available to move that resin around. So that goes down as the trees become stressed with drought. And there's two pretty good papers recently describing this process. And then some work that was done in Colorado, northern Colorado, Chapman et al., suggested that the drought that occurred in 2002 could have influenced the mountain pine beetle outbreak and lodgepole pine in that area. So here's the precipitation coinciding with the increase in tree mortality. So something to, and it's also been suggested to be a potential trigger for spruce beetle as well, some work that Justin DeRose did in southern Utah. So something to realize is that you can have lots of wind throw, and you can have lots of drought, And you can have lots of pathogens and never, ever, ever see an outbreak. What's important is that you get those trigger events as well as what I think these environmental conditions that help directly drive the beetle population. For example, if we go back, so when this drought occurred here, it was also at a time period when the temperatures, maximum August temperatures were high, and mostly just that August. So the drought occurred when it was also quite warm. And so a couple of other things to recall or remember or think about is that those conditions like the ones I was mentioning for spruce beetle, that's the conditions that could help get it going. You get the trigger, you get a blowdown, you get good temperature, you get drought, and then you have these nice susceptible landscapes. What's been found for both spruce beetle and mountain pine beetle is those conditions kind of go away as the outbreak progresses. They become less and less important. So if you're thinking about trying to use those conditions of basal area, stand density, and diameter, it really only matters right at the beginning. So you're going to need to do it before the outbreak progresses. And another important point is, kind of follows along with that, as the populations build, this notion of reduced tree defenses that help trigger the population, that becomes less important as well. And that's some work that was done by Celia Boone in British Columbia. So all of that is sort of conceptualized in this diagram from this paper, Raft et al. Bioscience, just showing that there's these feedbacks that have to occur across multiple scales, from the tree to the stand to the landscape, for a population to go from infesting part of a tree to infesting an entire landscape. And a large driver of that is temperature as well as stress.
Might be a good time to point out that we'll make all of the PowerPoint available on the web shortly after the workshop. Send that URL around so you can spend more time
looking at
it.
And so this is also from the Raft et al. Paper, and the point of it is to kind of highlight how these feedbacks that occur can be different depending on the bark beetle species in the host tree system. So basically, and this is a bit complicated, so I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on it, but basically, the red over here, this is for pinyon-nip, where it stays red the whole time, suggests that it's totally correlated with the environmental conditions. So pinyon-nip got, the trees were stressed, the population responded with that huge spike in mortality that we saw, but then when the stress went away, the population went down because of the feedback processes in that insect system. Whereas this is mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle, so they were also potentially triggered by some stress, but when the stress went away, the population size continued to grow, and it was no longer correlated with that stress condition because of the differences in, again, the feedback process. And this is described in this paper. But I think it's important to just highlight that a bark beetle is not a bark beetle, is not a bark beetle. They're not all the same. And then just again to highlight the temperature, it's a big part of all of this, and that's where my research, my research is focused on how temperature influences these insects. And there's two main ways. One, it keeps them so that they're synchronized. Their phenology is synchronized at appropriate times of the year. And then it also can influence them by causing mortality, cold temperatures. And we've done quite a bit of work looking in both of these species, mountain pine beetle and ESB, is my acronym for Engelmann spruce beetle. So we know that for mountain pine beetle and Engelmann and spruce beetle, they respond very similarly physiologically to cold temperatures. They both metabolize compounds, sort of antifreeze compounds, that allow them to tolerate cell freezing. And they do that so as the temperatures cool in the fall, they accumulate these compounds such that these are supercooling points. In the middle of winter is when they're the most tolerant of cold temperatures. So they could, if they're in this acclimation process and there's some spike of cold in the fall, then that could cause death, as well as if they get below the supercooling point. So it's not just what happens at the coldest time of the year, it's a process the entire time. And both of them do it the same, pretty much. But they have different ways of dealing how temperature influences their phenology. So spruce beetle is mostly semi-molting. In other words, it takes 2 years to produce one generation. And that's because there is 2 life stages that have a diapause. And the diapause is some induced arrested stage. So they go into that stage and they don't come out until conditions are right for them to come out. And what happens, they can also be univoltine, and in that case they still have this obligatory winter diapause, but what happens is they don't have this larval diapause. So basically, and we've looked at what it is that causes them to not go into this diapause, and it's basically warm summer temperatures that allow them to get past this stage so that they don't go into diapause, because it's a facultative diapause. So we looked at this in both the field and in the lab, and basically if they get, so this is they go through 4 larval instars, and at the end of the 4th, they stop feeding and make this chamber to pupate in. So basically if they get really warm temperatures as an early 4th instar, then they don't go into diapause, and that shifts them so they become an adult that first winter, and then they're on a univoltine life cycle. But if they get a cold temperature during the right time period, during this early 4th instar, then they go into diapause, and then they're on a 2-year life cycle. Oh, and we also looked, and we showed that the reproductive capacity of both the semi-voltine and the univoltine are pretty similar. So if they switch to univoltine, it could, result in exponential growth, basically. So mountain pine beetle at low elevations is typically univoltine. Although at high elevations, like in limber, white bark, any of those, bristlecone, it also can take 2 years. But there's no known diapause that we know of. However, and in both of these insects, and going back to the cold temperature, it's the eggs and the pupae that are the most susceptible to cold temperatures. So they've evolved these strategies so that they aren't an egg in the winter and they aren't a pupae in the winter. That's why it occurs in that 4th instar. And mountain pine beetle does a similar thing. It's also in this 4th instar. And what we've shown, so this is rate of development, and this is temperature. And so what we've shown is there's this very, very strong threshold for this instar 4 pre-pupae, where it has to have temperatures above 15, 16, 17 degrees before it will pupate. So this is so similar to spruce beetle, we think there might actually be a diapause here, but we haven't been able to show that yet.
What's the timing of that as far as your decrease in temperature? Are you looking at that fall or December?
So this insect, the trees are attacked in the summer, so July and August, and it all depends on temperature because as you can see, all of the instars have a different relationship with temperature. So if it's a warm summer and the trees are attacked in July, then it could become this in the fall. But again, it's trying to make sure it's not this in the winter. So it has this threshold that if it gets, it has to be pretty warm for it to decide, I'm going to go ahead and become a pupae. So again, it's a way of adaptation so that they synchronize with the climate. So I can't remember what I was going to say there, but we'll see. Oh, so that's basically how they've really adapted to living in their environment and surviving and dealing with the temperatures. So this is the area protection information, which I'm sure everybody in the room has seen, that Forest Health Protection. They fly over along with the Colorado State Forest Cooperation, showing for this time period for mountain pine beetle and spruce beetle. I had an animation kind of showing it through time, but there was so many time periods, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, down here in the southwest, where it wasn't flown. So it's, to me, almost meaningless, because there'd be a year with no detection, but it's because they didn't fly it. So I decided to not. It didn't seem relevant. But one thing that I thought was, and I don't work here, I work mostly in states west of here, so I'm kind of looking at this from afar. But one thing that was interesting to me is how the mountain pine beetle did sort of occur earlier, and spruce beetle is kind of still on its way up. And this afternoon I'll talk a little bit about showing not only some, so the strategies I showed on how they deal with temperature, we've actually developed some mechanistic models that describe that are driven by temperature. And so this afternoon I'll show some model runs on both current stuff going on as well as what we think might be, happening in the future as well for the state of Colorado. And then I just wanted to end, this is the slide I stole from Jeff Hickey and colleagues, that how bark beetle impact in the West is actually greater than fire, but somehow the funding agencies haven't figured that out, and fire gets so much more research dollars than us. All right, so that's it. And I'll answer any more questions.
Yeah, any questions for Barbara? Actually, I've got a question. Maybe someone else in the room has that, or be just unanswered. It sounded like spruce beetle is generally or almost always semi-molting, taking 2 years to complete the life cycle. Do we know San Juan spruce beetle population, have any of it, some minorities, switched to univolting completing 1 year?
I was thinking it'd be great to come over. I mean, I'll show this afternoon our models suggest that they have. So we can predict, given daily temperatures, what areas you would expect to have a higher probability of them having moved to at least part of the population. It's not like the whole population becomes univolting. There's some portion of it. Even in a single tree, one side of the tree can be semi-volting and one side can have beetles that come out in a 1 year. But it's easy to do sampling to determine that. And after running the models, I was like, oh, I need to come over and do some sampling and see. Yes?
Yes, the Rio Grande, the Gunnison Service Center did some studies on the Rio Grande last year on that. And most of it was 2 years, but they did find a couple of trees here and there with a 1 year cycle.
Yeah, so it's some small proportion is going through. It's the same with mountain pine beetle. We just are completing a study where even in a single tree, you'll have some that take 2 years and some that take 1 year, and these are at high elevation white bark pine stands. It's like they're doing anything they can to, get through in 1 year. Okay, thank you.